My name is Lila, and I'm about to tell you a story that changed my life forever. It all started when I was 28, working as a video editor and studying stock trading on the side. I'd always been ambitious, splitting my time between my day job and learning the ins and outs of the stock market. It was a crisp autumn morning when I walked into the seminar room, notebook in hand, ready to absorb every bit of knowledge I could. That's when I saw him, tall, confident, and undeniably handsome. Mark Stevens, our instructor for the day and a successful trader, 10 years my senior. As Mark began his lecture, I found myself captivated not just by his words, but by his presence. His eyes seemed to sparkle when he talked about market trends and investment strategies. I hung on to every word, scribbling notes furiously. During the break, I mustered up the courage to approach him with a question. "Mr. Stevens," I began, my voice shakier than I'd like to admit. He turned to me with a warm smile. "Please, call me Mark." I nodded, suddenly feeling like a schoolgirl with a crush. "Mark, I was wondering about your thoughts on emerging markets." What started as a simple question turned into an hour-long conversation. We discussed everything from market volatility to our favorite coffee shops. By the end of the seminar, I felt like I'd known him for years. "Lila," he said as we were leaving, "I've really enjoyed talking with you. Would you like to grab dinner sometime?" My heart skipped a beat. "I'd love to," I replied, trying to keep my cool. That dinner turned into weekly dates, and before I knew it, we were officially a couple. Mark was everything I'd ever dreamed of, smart, successful, and surprisingly down-to-earth, despite his wealth. He took me to fancy restaurants, whisked me away on weekend getaways, and showered me with affection. My friends were thrilled for me, especially my best friend, Lisa. "Girl, you've hit the jackpot," she squealed over brunch one day. "Rich, handsome, and he treats you like a queen? When's the wedding?" I laughed, blushing. "Come on, Lisa. We've only been dating for a few months." 1 year into our relationship, on a moonlit beach during a tropical vacation, Mark got down on one knee. "Lila," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you've made this past year the best of my life. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy streamed down my face as I nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Mark. 1,000 times yes." As we embraced, I felt on top of the world. I was engaged to the man of my dreams, my career was taking off, and I was making steady progress in my trading. Life couldn't get any better, I thought. The months leading up to our wedding were a whirlwind of excitement and planning. Mark and I were on cloud nine, spending every free moment discussing our future together. We'd decided on a spring wedding, giving us plenty of time to arrange everything. As the big day approached, I found myself busier than ever. Between my video editing work, trading studies, and wedding preparations, I barely had a moment to breathe. Mark, being the supportive fiancé he was, took care of most of the arrangements. 2 days before the wedding, I was at home, finalizing some edits for a client when Mark called. "Lila, we need to talk about something important," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my stomach tightening with worry. "Everything's fine," he assured me. "But I think we should sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding." "A prenup?" I repeated, trying to keep the shock out of my voice. "Why do we need one?" Mark sighed. "It's just a precaution, Lila. With my assets and our different financial situations, it's the smart thing to do. It protects both of us." I sat there, stunned. Part of me understood his reasoning, but another part felt hurt. Didn't he trust me? Didn't he believe in our love? I don't know, Mark, I stammered. "This is all so sudden. I'd need to talk to a lawyer, wouldn't I?" "Of course," he replied quickly. "I've already arranged for my lawyer to draw up the agreement. He can explain everything to you. Don't worry, it's all standard stuff." I wanted to argue, to ask for more time, but I felt overwhelmed. The wedding was just around the corner, and I didn't want to cause any problems. Plus, I had no property of my own, what did I have to lose? Okay, I said finally. I'll meet with the lawyer. The next day, I found myself sitting across from Mark's lawyer, a stern-looking man named Mr. Thompson. He explained the prenup to me in legal jargon that made my head hurt. Essentially, Ms. Collins, he concluded, this agreement stipulates that all property remains separate throughout the marriage. In the event of a divorce, each party retains their own assets. You'll both contribute to a joint account for living expenses, but everything else stays separate. I signed the papers, pushing down the nagging doubt in my gut. This was Mark, after all, the man I loved and trusted. Why was I worrying? The day of our wedding arrived, picture perfect and filled with joy. As I walked down the aisle towards Mark, his face beaming with love, I forgot all about prenups and lawyers. This was the beginning of our happily ever after. The first year of our marriage was like a dream. Mark and I settled into a luxurious house he owned, and he even gave me one of his cars to use. I felt like I was living a fairy tale, complete with a handsome prince and a castle. I continued my work as a video editor from home, which gave me the flexibility to focus more on trading. With Mark's guidance, I was making significant progress. My investments were paying off, and I was starting to accumulate a decent amount of savings. One evening, as we sat on our plush sofa sipping wine, I broached a subject I'd been considering for a while. Mark, I've been thinking, I began. With the money I've saved from trading, I'd like to buy an apartment for myself. What do you think? Mark set down his wine glass and turned to face me fully. Actually, Lila, I wanted to talk to you about something. I have a loan that I took out before our wedding, and I'm having some trouble paying it off. I was hoping you might be able to help me with that. I blinked, surprised. Mark had never mentioned financial troubles before. A loan? How much are we talking about? About the same amount you've saved up, he said, his eyes pleading. I promise I'll pay you back, and we can look into getting you that apartment later. What do you say? I hesitated. It was a lot of money I'd worked hard to save. But this was my husband asking for help. Wasn't that what marriage was about? Supporting each other? Okay, I agreed finally. I'll help you pay off the loan. Mark's face lit up. He pulled me into a tight hug. Thank you, Lila. You're the best wife a man could ask for. Months passed, and life continued as usual. Mark was often away on business trips, buying and selling properties in different cities. I threw myself into my work and trading, determined to build up my savings again. Then, one sunny morning, everything changed. I woke up feeling nauseous and dizzy. At first, I thought it was just a bug, but as the symptoms persisted, a different possibility dawned on me. With shaking hands, I took a pregnancy test. As I waited for the results, my mind raced. Were we ready for this? How would Mark react? When 2 pink lines appeared on the stick, confirming my suspicions, a mix of emotions washed over me, joy, excitement, and a hint of fear. That evening, when Mark returned from his latest trip, I greeted him with the news. Mark, I said, my voice trembling slightly, I'm pregnant. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. We're going to be parents? I nodded, relief flooding through me at his positive reaction. The months of my pregnancy flew by in a blur of doctor's appointments, nursery preparations, and a growing anticipation for our little one's arrival. Mark was attentive at first, accompanying me to ultrasounds and helping pick out baby furniture. But as my due date approached, his business trips became more frequent and longer. I need to secure our financial future, he'd say when I expressed my disappointment. Especially now that we're going to have a child. I tried to understand, focusing instead on preparing for motherhood. My trading took a back seat as I devoted my energy to staying healthy and learning everything I could about caring for a newborn. When our son, Ethan, finally arrived after 18 hours of labor, I was exhausted but overjoyed. Mark was there for the birth, holding my hand and beaming with pride as he held our son for the first time. He's perfect, Mark whispered, eyes glistening with tears. For a moment, everything felt right in the world. But the bubble of new parenthood bliss quickly popped as reality set in. Mark returned to work almost immediately, leaving me to navigate the challenges of caring for a newborn largely on my own. The sleepless nights, constant feedings, and overwhelming responsibility began to take their toll. One particularly rough morning, after being up all night with a colicky Ethan, I broached the subject with Mark. "I think we should hire a nanny," I suggested, bouncing a fussy Ethan on my hip. "Just part-time, to help out a bit. I'm struggling here. I can't work, I can't trade, I can barely sleep." "That's motherhood," he cut me off. "You'll adjust. We don't need to waste money on a nanny." I was too exhausted to argue further, but his words stung. When had he become so callous? As the weeks passed, I noticed another troubling development. Mark had stopped transferring money into our joint account for living expenses. When I checked our account, I was shocked to see how low the balance had gotten. "Mark," I confronted him one evening after putting Ethan to bed, "why haven't you been putting money in our joint account? I've been paying for everything, groceries, bills, even the property taxes on the house." He barely looked up from his phone. "Things are a bit tight right now with the business." "You're handling it, aren't you? That's what stay-at-home moms do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But that's not what we agreed on." "And what about my car?" "The insurance is due." "Your car?" he scoffed. "It's my car, Lila. I'm letting you use it." The words hit me like a slap. I suddenly felt very small and very alone. From that day on, I shouldered all the household expenses. I dipped into what was left of my savings, stretched every dollar, and did my best to keep us afloat. There were times when I had to choose between buying diapers for Ethan or food for myself. I always chose Ethan. As Ethan approached his second birthday, I found myself hitting a stride with my trading. Late nights and early mornings paid off, and I managed to make several successful deals in a row. One afternoon, I decided it was time to treat myself. I'd been eyeing a new car, nothing too flashy, but something practical with a large trunk for Ethan's stroller and our groceries. Excited about the prospect, I waited for Mark to come home to share my plans. "Mark," I said as he walked through the door, "I've been thinking. I'd like to buy a new car. Something more suitable for Ethan and me." Mark's expression darkened. "Actually, Lila, I need to talk to you about something important. My business is going through a rough patch, and I could use some capital to tide things over. I was hoping you could lend me the money you've saved." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. This felt all too familiar. "Mark, you still haven't paid me back from the last time I lent you money. Remember? When I wanted to buy an apartment?" His face flushed with anger. "Are you keeping score? I thought we were partners. I need this money to keep our lifestyle afloat. If you don't help me, I'll have no choice but to consider a divorce." The word hung in the air between us like a guillotine. To my own surprise, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. "If that's what you want, Mark, then maybe we should divorce." His eyes widened, clearly not expecting this response. "You can't be serious. You'd be nothing without me. Remember the prenup?" I squared my shoulders. "I remember. But I've been nothing with you for a long time now. I think it's time I stand on my own 2 feet." Mark's face contorted with rage. "Fine. You have 3 days to get out of my house. And don't even think about taking anything that isn't yours. I have an army of lawyers who will bury you if you try." The next 3 days were a blur of packing, crying, and trying to explain to a confused Ethan why we were leaving. I left behind the car Mark had given me, along with all the furniture and appliances. I rented a small apartment near Ethan's daycare and threw myself into my work. Days blurred into nights as I monitored the stock market, made trades, and cared for Ethan. My savings were a lifeline, and I thanked my past self for having the foresight to squirrel away money. The divorce process moved quickly, mostly because I didn't contest anything. I couldn't prove that I had lent Mark money, and his threats to take Ethan away terrified me into silence. In the end, I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back, Ethan's belongings, and a meager child support payment. The months following the divorce were challenging, to say the least. Balancing single motherhood with my work on the stock market pushed me to my limits. But slowly, surely, we found our rhythm. One crisp autumn morning, as I was dropping Ethan off at his daycare, I noticed a man struggling with a car seat. He was tall, with kind eyes and a flustered expression that I found oddly endearing. "Need a hand?" I offered, approaching him. He looked up, relief washing over his face. "Please. I swear, these things are designed by evil geniuses." I laughed, showing him how to adjust the straps. "I'm Lila, by the way. And this little guy is Ethan." "I'm David," he replied, shaking my hand. "And this little troublemaker is Jack." "Thanks for the help, Lila." As it turned out, Jack was in the same group as Ethan. Over the next few weeks, David and I often crossed paths during drop-offs and pickups. We'd chat about the kids, exchange parenting war stories, and occasionally grab coffee together while the boys played. One Saturday, David suggested we take the kids to the local amusement park. As we sat on a bench, watching Ethan and Jack on the merry-go-round, David turned to me. "You know, Lila, I was wondering if if you'd like to have dinner with me sometime?" "Just the two of us?" The invitation caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered dating since the divorce. But looking at David's hopeful expression, I felt a spark of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I arrived at the restaurant, my heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. David was already there, looking handsome in a blue shirt that brought out his eyes. We had just ordered our meals when I heard a familiar voice that made my blood run cold. Well. If it isn't my ex-wife." I looked up to see Mark standing at our table, a young woman clinging to his arm. His eyes raked over me, his lip curling in a sneer. "My, Lila, you're looking, let's just say the years haven't been kind," he said with a cruel laugh. "Nothing like my Veronica here." The woman giggled, eyeing me with disdain. I sat there, frozen, as Mark continued his tirade. "It's sad, really. You used to be somewhat attractive. Now look at you, a washed-up single mother, barely scraping by." I felt tears pricking at my eyes, shame and anger warring within me. But before I could respond, David stood up, his voice quiet but firm. "I think you need to leave," he said to Mark, his tall frame towering over my ex-husband. "Or we can step outside and discuss your matters further." Mark's face paled. He muttered something under his breath, then turned and left, practically dragging Veronica behind him. David reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Do you want to talk about it?" And so, over our meal, I found myself opening up to David about my marriage, the divorce, and everything that had happened since. He listened without judgment, his hand a comforting presence on mine. As we finished our dessert, David looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Lila, have you considered fighting back? It sounds like there were some serious issues with your divorce settlement." I shook my head. I wouldn't even know where to start. "And Mark has all those lawyers." David's eyes lit up. "Actually, I might be able to help with that. You see, I'm a lawyer myself." As he began to explain some potential legal avenues we could explore, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was the beginning of my fight for justice. The days following my dinner with David were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. We met at his office, a modest but professional space that immediately put me at ease. "Okay, Lila," David said, his tone shifting from the friendly dad I knew to a focused professional. "I've reviewed the documents you brought. Can you walk me through the timeline of events leading up to your prenuptial agreement?" I took a deep breath and began recounting the details: the whirlwind romance, the surprise prenup just days before the wedding, the lawyer provided by Mark. As I spoke, David's frown deepened. "Lila," he interrupted gently, "did you realize that signing a prenup so close to the wedding date is actually a violation?" I blinked in surprise. "It is?" David nodded. Yes, and that's just the first issue I've noticed. You mentioned you didn't have your own lawyer review the document? No, I admitted. Mark said there wasn't time, and his lawyer assured me everything was standard. David's expression hardened. That's another violation. You should have been advised to seek independent legal counsel. He paused, flipping through the papers. And there's more. You said Mark had a loan he didn't disclose before the marriage? I nodded, a spark of hope igniting in my chest. That should have been included in the prenup's appendix, David explained. Its omission is a serious oversight. As David continued to point out the flaws in the prenup, I felt a mix of anger and relief wash over me. All this time, I believed I was powerless, but now I was learning that the very document that had trapped me was built on shaky ground. Lila, David said, leaning forward, I think we have a strong case to challenge the prenuptial agreement. If we're successful, it could be nullified, which means you could be entitled to half of the marital assets. I sat back, stunned. The possibility of finally receiving a fair settlement after years of struggle and sacrifice was overwhelming. The day of the court hearing arrived. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Mark sitting with his team of lawyers. He smirked when he saw me, clearly expecting an easy victory. Before the judge had even called the session to order, Mark leaned towards me from where he stood a few paces away. His voice was low, a venomous whisper meant only for me. You're a loser. You think you can beat me? I'll ruin you. And when I'm done, I'll take Ethan from you too. I kept silent, trusting my lawyer. The proceedings began, and David presented our case with a clarity and conviction that left me in awe. He methodically laid out each violation in the prenup, backing every claim with solid legal precedents. I watched as Mark's face grew increasingly pale. When it was his turn to speak, he blustered and threatened, but his arguments seemed weak in comparison to David's well-prepared statements. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared her throat. Having reviewed the evidence presented, I find that the prenuptial agreement in question was indeed executed under dubious circumstances. Therefore, I am ruling to nullify the agreement. I gasped, tears springing to my eyes. David squeezed my hand reassuringly as the judge continued. Furthermore, given this nullification, the divorce settlement must be revisited. According to state law, marital assets acquired during the union are to be divided equally between parties. Mark exploded from his seat. This is outrageous. I won't stand for it. The judge's gavel came down hard. Mr. Stevens, control yourself or I'll hold you in contempt. My decision is final. The weeks following the court ruling were a blur of legal proceedings and property evaluations. As it turned out, Mark had acquired significant assets during our marriage, 3 apartments in the city center and several non-residential properties on the outskirts. The total value was estimated at over $2 million, half of which was now rightfully mine. I remember the day I received the final settlement papers. Sitting at my small kitchen table, Ethan playing with his toys nearby, I stared at the documents in disbelief. The number at the bottom of the page seemed surreal, $1,050,000. My share of the property and assets. Mommy, why are you crying? Ethan's small voice broke through my daze. I quickly wiped my eyes, pulling him into a hug. Happy tears, sweetheart. Very happy tears. As for Mark, his life has changed dramatically. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he'd started drinking heavily, his business partners distancing themselves after the embarrassing court case. Meanwhile, I focused on moving forward. With David's help, I navigated the complexities of my newfound wealth. We decided to rent out the properties I'd acquired in the settlement, providing me with a steady stream of passive income. As the dust settled, I found myself with more time and resources than I'd had in years. I threw myself into being the best mother I could be for Ethan, relishing the ability to provide him with opportunities I'd only dreamed of before. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan and I were leaving the park, we bumped into David and Jack. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching our sons play. You know, David said softly, I was wondering if maybe you'd like to go out again sometime? Just the two of us? A warm feeling spread through my chest. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, I found myself smiling. I'd like that very much, David. As we made plans for our date, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced in a long time. As the months rolled by, life settled into a new rhythm. The absence of Mark in our lives became less of a void and more of a relief. Ethan occasionally asked about his father, but the questions grew less frequent as time passed. Truthfully, I was grateful for Mark's absence. Each day without his toxic presence felt like a breath of fresh air. One evening, as I was going through some paperwork, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Hey Lila, how about we take the boys to that new adventure park this weekend?" I smiled, warmth spreading through my chest. These family outings had become a regular occurrence, and I found myself looking forward to them more and more. Saturday arrived, and soon we were navigating the ropes courses and zip lines of the adventure park. Watching Ethan and Jack race each other across wobbly bridges, their laughter echoing through the trees, filled me with a joy I hadn't felt in years. As the boys tackled a particularly challenging obstacle, David and I found a moment alone. David turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "Lila, these past few months have been amazing. Seeing you with Jack, me with Ethan. I feel like we've become a real family. And I was wondering, well, hoping really, if you'd consider making it official?" For a moment, I stood frozen, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. "David, are you?" He grinned, dropping to one knee right there in the middle of the adventure park. "Lila, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to my eyes as I nodded emphatically. Yes, of course." As David slipped a beautiful ring onto my finger, I heard cheering. Looking up, I saw Ethan and Jack watching us, huge smiles on their faces. Later that evening, as we celebrated our engagement over ice cream, David turned to me with a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know," he said, "I was thinking about drawing up a prenup." For a split second, I felt a flash of panic before I caught the teasing tone in his voice. David laughed, squeezing my hand. "I'm kidding, of course. But if I did, there'd only be one condition, that you promise to love me forever." I leaned in, kissing him softly. "That's one condition I'm happy to agree to." As we sat there, surrounded by our boys, I marveled at the journey that had brought me to this point. From the depths of a toxic marriage to the heights of newfound love and family, I'd weathered storms I never thought I'd survive. But survive I did. And not just survive, I thrived.